So, after a bit of a snafu, I finally got my review copies that were graciously granted to me by Paizo of Pathfinder 2nd Edition Revised version, or Pathfinder Revised Edition. I don't know. The revised version needs to be a better name for it, like Pathfinder 2.1, I think a lot of people are calling it. I'm been wanting to branch out. Cypher is still hands down my favorite system. There's a reason I'm writing my next big book in the Cypher system. I'm definitely, that's going to be probably the lion's share of my channel still, but I wanted to branch out more because maybe not a lot of you realize I do play other games than Cypher. I'm in a D&D game on Wednesdays. On Thursdays, a buddy of mine is running us through Rise of the Ruin Lords. I have lots of experience with Pathfinder 1st Edition, and I have a little bit of experience with Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In 2nd Edition, I only did a handful of sessions. We did a little bit online and a little, like 1 or 2 sessions like in person. So I don't have a lot of experience there. So for the most part, the system's kind of new to me. In fact, the only reason I was able to run it as successfully as I did before is because Foundry kind of did a bit of the hand holding for me. I'd like forget things and Foundry would be like, well, this applied. And I'm like, oh, cool. So what I wanted to do is, now that I have these books and I'm reviewing them, I want to go through them with you from, say, more like a newbie's standpoint, my initial thoughts and how my feelings about it and everything from someone that's first experiencing this edition that doesn't really know much about it. So this first video, as you can tell, since I'm kind of rambling, is not scripted. This is just going to be my initial thoughts video. I've done some quick read-throughs of the books. Haven't really picked them apart yet, just like quick read-throughs. And this is just what I first am getting out of these books, basically. I'm going to start first with like the actual layout of the book. As someone that does a lot of layouts in the RPG industry for other people and whatnot, obviously it's kind of one of the first things I notice. Layout is really important for how well the book is received. You can have all the shiny art in the world, but if the layout is terrible and you can't read the words, then the book is going to be terrible. Paizo is usually spot on with its layout. I've seen some better, but very few. Paizo's up there for as far as like ease of use and readability. Like it wasn't long ago I picked up the Rage of Elements book just because it looked pretty and I wanted to see what the layout looked like, even though like I haven't not really been delving into Pathfinder 2e that much yet. And I gotta say, it was a very pretty book indeed. They definitely bang out those layouts. 1 or 2 things I wish they would change, like the sidebar, the saturation is a little bit too high. I would desaturate that a little bit because the white text on that saturated of a green on a digital screen is a little hard on the eyes. In the book, it's probably okay, but on the digital screen, which is I think where a lot of people are reading these days, it is hard to see. Other than that, the layout, very straightforward and simple. I'm assuming the copy that I got is going to be basically the copy that was sent to the printers, so I'm assuming that's what it's going to be. There was a couple of like weird little measurement bits to it I would have changed, but honestly, like it's still top tier echelon, like one of the better layouts. Maybe not quite to the level of like some of like Free League's published books. Those have some pretty crazy layouts, but it is certainly better than a lot of books that I've read. I'm not going to name which companies, but you'll know, if you know. I do like some of the changes. I'm assuming this is going to be in the book as well. For example, they got rid of like the parchment style background that you've seen in D&D since 3rd edition, basically. And it looks like it's just like a plain white with the black text over in the main boxed area. Yes, thank you. That is super nice. So if you have the digital version, not only could you print out like a page or two and it's like not going to be an entire page of like, but it makes it easier to read. It's a higher contrast value. So the little touches like that in the layout have been super nice. Getting into the content itself, once again, I've only done a quick read through because I got the 2 books a little bit later than some of the other reviewers, and I'm in the middle of a kitchen remodel, so I haven't been able to go through it in that much detail yet. But quick read through, there's a lot of things that I like, and I'm comparing this mostly to basically like D&D or other similar games because once again, I don't have a ton of experience with Pathfinder 2nd Edition yet. I am coming to this as more of a newbie angle. The book obviously starts with the whole introduction. What is an RPG? Which honestly, if this is going to be one of the main systems that people may be introduced to tabletop RPGs with, you still need it. In some little indie systems, I sometimes consider this a waste of space. I don't think you need it if it's going to be some little indie RPG. It's probably not going to be their first RPG. But if you're playing something like Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, this is probably going to be your first RPG. And you got to know your audience. So I'm actually okay with the fact that they have their intro and like, what's an RPG? What are the dice? Blah, 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 blah. Then we see some major changes that start to depart from Dungeons and Dragons. Things like dropping the ability scores, dropping alignment, things I've been asking for years. I've always been like anti-alignment and anti-ability scores since 3rd edition. Ability scores haven't actually done anything since 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. Up and after that point, from 3rd edition on, they've just been kind of a leftover, holdover thing. Alignments to a degree as well. I don't think I've used alignments since like the very early 2000s. It's been like 20 years since I've used alignments. So I see that they've rejuggled which classes are like their base classes as well as races and whatnot. Very happy to see the Leshy is a base race. I mean, everyone loves little plant people. Come on. Classes, I was a little surprised at just for only one class. I was surprised to see the Witch as a core class in the first book because Player Core 2 will be coming out in, I think, summer of next year. But Barbarian was not, which like Barbarian has been since 3rd edition. D&D, Barbarian's kind of been one of those classic fantasy classes. Barbarian has always been one of the main classes and is a fairly often played class. Now, one of the things I'm seeing with this is although there are changes, it's mostly verbiage changes. There's tweaks as well, but a lot of it's verbiage changes. So you can still play the Barbarian from normal Pathfinder 2nd edition in a Pathfinder like 2.1 game. So there's nothing stopping you from still playing a Barbarian, which is super nice. I'm glad that they managed to do this in such a way that it's still compatible. All your books that you bought for 2nd edition are going to be compatible with 2.1 for the most part, with maybe a couple minor tweaks. I'm liking the way Paizo handled this so far. It's very, very much impressing me on the way they're handling it. Certainly a lot smoother than another dragon-based company. The thing they're replacing alignments with, the edicts and anathema, I'm not sure they were needed unless it's got like, I mean, if it had some mechanical values, but these don't seem to have mechanical values per se. It's more like a series of checks and balances and limitations, especially for the clerics, which is kind of an odd thing. Honestly, edicts and anathema is kind of like alignment. I'm not sure how much people are really going to rely on it or use it. Now, there may be some mechanics tied to them that I haven't seen yet because I've only done like the quick overview. But so far, Edicts and Anathema is not something I see as like a really big need. Current world lore, like looking at the map and looking at things, like I remember I was starting to have to update myself with 2nd edition and now 2.1 because my world lore is like I've got like the world book or whatever from 1st edition Pathfinder, and that's where all my knowledge comes from. So there's been updates over time. I really got to probably sit down and just like read through and go through all the changes, but it seems very solid. It's still Galarian, even if there's been some changes and updates over time. So I'm pretty happy with that. Galarian's probably one of my favorite like fantasy tabletop settings. It's got a little bit of everything. You travel somewhere and you're basically in a new campaign setting. So I've really liked Galarian. So I'm glad that for the most part, it's still the Galarian that I remember from the older edition. So the way feats work, I'm glad that they haven't really changed it too much from 2nd edition, but I'm glad it's not like 1st edition. So getting into this, I've always said that feats to me is what killed 3.x/Pathfinder 1st edition. Now I realized afterwards it wasn't the feats themselves that I disliked, because I actually kind of liked the way the feats work in 2nd edition. It was the overly complicated feat chains that I disliked in 1st edition. The fact that if I wanted to use a whip successfully, I needed to like take these 5 feats in a very specific order at these certain levels, and like I had to pre-plan my character basically. Pathfinder 2nd edition has managed to dial it back and make feats as customization options. Basically, they call everything feats, even if they would have been abilities or something before. And yes, some of them have prerequisites. I'm fine with the occasional prerequisites on feats, but they have dialed it back where there's not these huge, long, convoluted feat chains, as far as I can tell, which is what killed the older editions for me. You can still progress organically, and you don't have to pre-plan everything in your character. You can, there's nothing stopping you from doing that, but I like the fact that it doesn't sort of force you to do so, which is something I absolutely detested. So I was originally a little weirded out by the fact that they split it into player core and GM core, when in the previous, like in 1 and 2, it was just one book. You're like, I buy one book and I'm all set. I don't want to have to buy 2 books until I looked at the page count total between them. First edition and initial printing of 2nd edition, the page count was about 600 to 650, I think, pages, somewhere around there. The player core and the GM core together is like 800 pages now. That's starting to get too big. So I understand why they split them. It's too much information. 800 page book is not something I want to have to try and leaf through. So I'm actually okay with the fact that it's not just a single core rule book. And so far, I'm pretty happy with what they've split between the books. I've spent more time reviewing the player core than I have the GM core so far. Once again, I'm just getting these books and I'm in the middle of a remodel, so it's taking me time. But so far, I'm pretty happy with where they've put different facets of the game. There are a few things in GM core I think the players could benefit from, but it's not like needed for the players, and it's something the GM would probably be throwing in there anyways. So I'm okay with the way that they split it. All in all, my thoughts on the initial leaf through of these books is I'm enjoying it. I think it's fairly well designed. I do have one other thought about it too. Now that I'm sitting down and actually picking apart the system, and everyone refers to it as Mathfinder. And for first edition Pathfinder, I think that is a very apt description. My character sheet for first edition Pathfinder looked like a spreadsheet. It was very much Mathfinder. In second edition, and in this case the revised, the 2.1 as we're calling it, or I'm calling it, I think some people are calling it, I don't think this is the best term for it. Maybe it involves slightly more math than D&D, but honestly, it's not like you have to figure things out too much. Like iterative attacks is one of the main things, and honestly, if you just pre-write them out on your character sheet, then you don't have to mentally math it too much. Like it's just the difference of like 5 or 4 or like whatever your character build has. And if you're 10 or above, I mean, that's just moving a decimal place to see if it's like a crit or crit fail or success or anything. So there's a little bit more math. There's a couple circumstances where you need to do a tiny bit more, but like it's grade school math, and it's not actually a lot more than Dungeons and Dragons. So I think calling this Mathfinder is a bit of a misnomer. Honestly, a lot of the things are pre-done on your character sheet. You're not having to figure out things on the fly. And as you level, I actually like the fact that some things are having to be recalculated and scaled, because in Dungeons and Dragons, you get your armor, you have your dexterity bonus, and 10 to 1, that's pretty much staying the same for most of the campaign. You might find some gear to increase it, stuff like that, but that's about it. Whereas like in Pathfinder, your armor class can scale with you as you become more proficient in using your armor and becoming a better adventurer. If you are not wanting to try out Pathfinder because you are scared of like everyone referring to it as Mathfinder and saying, oh, it's got all these like super complex calculations and shit, don't be. I would say the complexity comes from the fact that it's got more predefined tactical gameplay to it, but like, you know, it has the built-in flanking rules, but I mean, Dungeons and Dragons has optional flanking rules. Like that's already a thing in both. It's not that much more complicated when you really boil it down. When you really come down to it, you're rolling, you've got the number on your sheet that you're adding, and then you're seeing if you hit the target number. For the most part, yeah, there's a couple little extra like triggers or checks and balances, but for the most part, it's kind of the same thing as a D20 system, of like as any other D20 system. For the most part, it just has a few extra checks and balances. So if you're feeling scared of trying it because you're thinking it's too complicated, honestly, it's not that bad. And there's many circumstances where there's a few things I think that are actually even streamlined a little bit better than in Dungeons and Dragons, like the exploration mode and everything. I like the way that's set up. It helps to guide you through it a little bit better than D&D. You've got a lot of choices. That's the same thing with like the Cypher system, which is like my main go-to system, where the system itself is fairly simple, but you have a lot of choices. And I think a lot of the complexity for people isn't the game itself for Pathfinder. I think for Pathfinder, it's actually the same issue some people have with Cypher. I think it's more the choice paralysis on the number of options and character expression that you can do. Because you can patchwork your character together from various sources and various bits and bobs and really customize it and cobble it together. I think that's the real issue. I don't think it's actually a complexity of the rules themselves. Honestly, I have played way worse. Once again, not going to go over the editions, although Pathfinder First Edition was definitely one of them. But I've played far more complicated RPGs and still enjoyed them. Second edition Pathfinder and 2.1 especially, where they have smoothed over even some of the more rough edges. Honestly, it's a lot smoother and it's not nearly as complicated as you think. So I've rambled a bit. I apologize for that. My future videos will be a lot more structured, I promise. I'll be going through section by section and picking it apart. So this is right now my initial thoughts, and I just kind of wanted to word vomit it towards your ear holes and see what sticks at the moment. Because, yeah. So far, I'm not seeing any huge complaints on my initial perusal of it. I'm sure I'll probably nitpick a few things as I get a little more deeper and in depth into the rules. So far, this is pretty damn good. Now, it is for a specific style of play. Once again, if you're looking for a lighter system that's like more streamlined or something, but still has options than Cypher or the upcoming Vagabond RPG, maybe DC 20. I haven't checked it out yet, but my buddy Chris, aka Treant Monk, has been raving about it. So I really got to try and I want to check that one out. So if you want like something a bit more streamlined or traditional, a little simpler, like some of those other systems, if you want something super narrative, then you probably want to migrate more to like Fate or Powered by the Apocalypse. But if you don't mind a bit of tactical gameplay, if you don't mind the situations being a bit more predefined and a bit more gamified, if you will, Pathfinder is probably, I would say, a better choice out of those style of systems. It's well developed. It's got a good foundation to it. It's already got a lot of books released to it. All the World Lore books are fully compatible with this like 2.1 re-release that was primarily done to distance themselves from the OGL stuff. My initial assessment is thumbs up, give it a try. And once again, as this stuff gets released, Paizo is always very big on the fact that everything's going to be released open content. Okay, that is enough rambling for me this time. I will be starting basically at the start of the player core book and working my way through it, and then going through the GM core book and seeing what we can see. All right. As always, stay healthy, stay safe, and have a good one, eh?